Hello, and welcome to Three Levels of Stress, the latest episode in the Crossing Thin Ice podcast series brought to you by Actuarial Risk Management. My name is Max Rudolph, and I'm joined today, as always, by Dave Ingram. It's important to use consistent terminology with stakeholders to ensure the meaning is understood. In today's podcast, Dave shares how he has worked with insurers to develop three levels of stress that can be managed and communicated. We discuss how this was incorporated into a professional standard and how to reinvent heat maps to be more useful to practitioners. Please note, as always, that our offerings are educational and not investment advice. Now on to our show.
Many people are uncomfortable with doing stress testing. There are no clear standards of how bad a stress test needs to be. That makes stress testing seem dangerous. The danger is that they would do a stress test and later learn that they were much harder on themselves than another company. And that could lead an observer to wrongly conclude that their company, with the most severe stress test, is the weakest, when no such thing is necessarily true. Stress testing just seems to be too open-ended and undefined. A common language about stress testing needs to be developed and used to help prevent this from happening. But that's difficult. It's difficult because there is not one definition of stress that fits what everyone wants. Regulators seem to be the most focused on company failure, and they are therefore most interested in extreme loss situations that might not have any realistic likelihood of ever happening. On the other hand, management is often focused on things that might challenge earnings in the short term, while the board needs to be looking beyond the likely tenure of current management to assess the long-term viability of the firm. To deal with these conflicting objectives, stress testing needs to include several different levels of stresses. Let's look at three levels. The first, normal variability. Stresses are based upon events that might result in the worst year in a normal 5 or 10-year period. The second we'll call realistic disaster. That's the worst experience that is reasonably expected over a long period of time as the stress event. To put that on a human scale, let's look at something like a 40-year time period, the length of a single person's career. And then the third level of stress we'll call a worst case, a maximum plausible loss that could occur even if you believe that likelihood is extremely remote. This might be significantly worse than the realistic disaster. As you might imagine, management will be able to use the normal volatility stress test for their earnings risk management focus. The board can work with a realistic disaster when they are looking to assess the long-term viability of the company, and the regulator can assess company failure risk from the worst-case scenario. If you wanted to apply this approach, for example, to equity risk, the normal volatility stress would be something like a 7% drop in the market. Over the past 50 years, 7% has been a 10-year worst case about half the time. For a realistic disaster, you might choose a market drop of 25%. In fact, 26.5 was the worst market drop in 49 of the past 50 years. And then for the worst case scenario, a market drop of 50% could be used. That's an intra-year drop in the market in 2009. These three levels of adversity would be handled differently by a risk management framework. The company could target handling normal volatility via a risk control cycle process and the breakthrough losses kept to amounts that can be absorbed into earnings. Realistic disasters will sometimes be large enough that they cannot be absorbed into earnings, but must be absorbed through capital. These stresses then become the focus of capital management and capital adequacy assessment. They are considered to be remote but plausible adverse events. The products or other activities that are most associated with these scenarios would then be thought of as driving the need for the risk capital buffer of the company. Worst-case scenarios are sometimes quite large, but are also highly unlikely. It is very difficult for a management team to focus on such events. These scenarios are tested primarily out of curiosity, and the test results may or may not drive any risk management actions because they're so remote. But since regulators do want to look at those types of scenarios, they can get a sense of which types of events would drive an industry-wide problem or a problem for a single company that has a higher exposure or vulnerability to a particular worst-case scenario. Of course, to get the best information about these types of situations, the regulator would be best served by asking all insurers to look at their potential losses under the same worst-case scenarios. Unfortunately, regulators themselves do not yet seem to have had this insight. This approach to stress testing can be applied to all of your significant risks, and if applied year after year, can add a layer of comparability both between risks and between years for a company. And if this three-tiered approach is adopted by multiple companies, stress testing can start to be developed towards intercompany comparability because we're all using the same language.
Before we move on to part 2 of today's podcast, we want to tell you about ARM's ERM Advisory Services. Our ERM advisory team, led by Dave Ingram and myself, Max Rudolph, are available to provide a wide range of support to your enterprise risk management program. Here are samples of recent projects. The New Strategies and Risk Solutions for Executives series of newsletters, webcasts, and discussions is our latest offering. A full range of topics are also available for presentation in person, live via webcast, or delivered as a recording for general staff education on ERM, advanced training for risk management staff, or to provide background on risk management to executives and board members. You can even mix and match, reserving us for a day or more with time split between education and risk discussions. Our ERM team has worked with insurers to install new ERM programs and revitalize older programs that have fallen into disuse. The ERM programs are designed to be consistent with regulatory and rating agency expectations, aligned with company strategy and culture, and bring real value to company management and your board. Dave, can you start out by telling us how or why you picked these 3 levels?
I guess the story of how I started doing this was, and Max, you were involved in this. We were working for the Academy of Actuaries, developing the actuarial standards for what we came to call a capital adequacy assessment instead of an ORSA. One of the members of the group said, "Well, what happens if you have a company that decides to just not assess themselves with very adverse scenarios?" We saw that as a problem, and we thought coming up with some terminology like this would help the regulators and would help companies to be able to communicate as to how consistent they were in their scenarios, so that if somebody tells you that, well, I've done a realistic disaster scenario, in the example I use, my realistic disaster for my stock portfolio is 5% loss. It's pretty easy to look around and say, nah, that's probably not a realistic disaster. Maybe you ought to try and do that again.
Have you ever used this approach with an insurer, and how did it work out?
Lots. I've worked on about 20 ORSAs that were submitted to regulators, and we always use this approach in all 20 of those. And so the interesting feedback to me is I've never gotten a question about it, nor have my clients gotten a question about this approach, so that it's been just accepted without comment by the regulators. Neither have I gotten a question from any of the clients when we use this approach. Everybody seemed to just feel comfortable with that terminology and seemed to If they didn't understand, they never mentioned it.
Well, I remember when we first started talking about it with the ASOP, we were having a discussion about how to call these different things, and then you came up with this and shared it, and then the discussion just went really smoothly after that, because it was fairly natural, and it was one of those where you don't think of it until somebody else thinks of it, and then it just makes sense.
And we did wind up putting something along, not this exact terminology, but the same exact idea into the actuarial standard of practice. So if you're working on this with a company, the standard of practice suggests that you use something like this.
Right. So the most interesting term that you used is worst case. So does worst case really mean worst case?
Now that's definitely an actuarial question. I've only ever gotten that question from actuaries, and most actuaries that I've worked with on this have asked that question. No, it does not mean worst case. Whatever you come up with is a worst case, just like the elementary school kids, whatever number you come up with, I can come up with one larger. There's always a worst case than whatever, but I just called it worst case because it's the way the regulators think. That if you tell them you're showing them a worst case, they look at that and they nod their heads, and then they go away.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. You just shared an example about equity risk a few minutes ago. Dave, can you give us another example?
Sure, I'll give an example that should resonate with absolutely everybody that hears this, which is related to pandemic. So if you think of a normal volatility scenario for a pandemic, you would get a bad flu season, because that's supposed to be like a worst in 10 years. So a bad flu season there where you'd have more illnesses, some more deaths, but a very small number. And that would be your normal volatility scenario. And this might be controversial with some folks, but I would consider what we've experienced with COVID to be a realistic disaster scenario. And just comparing that to what other historical disease scenarios have been, the actual COVID experience was fairly mild. Some of that because of our advanced capabilities to respond in terms of how quickly we were able to get a very effective vaccine out, but also in terms of the actual underlying severity of the COVID-19 virus was something in the lower end of major pandemics, and then a worst case scenario. I would put that something worse than the 1918 pandemic, perhaps, so that you had quite a lot of people infected and many deaths and quite a lot of economic activity halted because of the severity of the disease and the if we think that the lockdowns were destructive economically under COVID-19, if you had a much more severe pandemic that was causing major illnesses and many more deaths, the reaction to the lockdown would be probably much significantly more intense and would cause more economic problems. So that scenario would be to have not just the very temporary dip in economic activity that we saw with COVID-19, but something that lasted a year or more in terms of the economic impact of the pandemic.
Right, that's an interesting response. How would you use this idea when constructing a heat map?
My heat map would look different than the heat maps that people are used to looking at. And in the usual looking heat maps kind of look like a scatter diagram because there's points all over the place. In a heat map that was constructed using this idea, each risk would have a dot in each of three different rows of the heat map. and the dots then would be in a line across the heat map, so that if you had frequency on the vertical axis and severity on the horizontal axis, you would have the low frequency events, the normal volatility in the bottom row, and you'd have a string of dots representing all the risks that you evaluated there, and showing which one has the highest normal volatility effect, which one has the lowest, and which ones are in the middle, and whether they're clumped towards the high end or towards the low end. And the same kind of thing, you'd have a row of dots in the middle of the chart, where that's your realistic disaster row, and you'd see whether or not there was any shift, and there should be a shift in terms of severity, should be quite significant shift to severity, but whether any of the dots shifted more than what the bulk of them did. Maybe if you think of it in terms of normal distribution to statistics, the normal volatility might be 1 standard deviation, the realistic disaster might be 2 standard deviations. And so that would suggest everything's shifting the same. But if there are any risks that have a fatter tail than a normal distribution, that would shift more than the doubling effect that you would see with that sort of normal distribution estimation. And then on the top row, again, you'd have a row of dots, which would be perhaps most likely significantly to the right of a lot of the dots that you had below for the worst case scenarios. And there you should see some of the risks definitely having a shift, because those are risks with when you get out into those worst case scenarios, you probably have some that have much fatter tails.
I love to hear Dave's practical ideas about risk management. From a working definition of realistic disaster and worst case to dealing with fat-tailed distributions, developing a plan to manage levels of stress can lead to better outcomes and improved levels of communications with stakeholders like investors, rating agencies, and regulators. We hope that you have found this episode of Crossing Thin Ice, presented by Actuarial Risk Management, valuable. Please like, subscribe, and share with your colleagues. We look forward to visiting with you again.